Conquest of Bread is the anarcho-communist starting point. It's why the lefty side of YouTube is called BreadTube. Let's begin. Kropotkin begins by laying the groundwork for his theories. Firstly, he acknowledges the general communist themes. The means of production are in the hands of the few. Quote, the land, the mines, the highways, machinery, food, shelter, education, knowledge, all have been seized by the few in the course of that long story of robbery. End quote. The current capitalist system not only robs the working class of the means to produce, it robs them of their wealth, comfort, and basic dignity. Kropotkin separates himself from Marx in this beginning section. Marx and Kropotkin differ in several significant ways. For one, Marx believes that the value of a product can be calculated by the immediate input. If a man works for 10 hours to make a chair, that chair is worth the labor of 10 hours. This is similarly applied to complicated machinery that has taken the work of generations to perfect. By this I mean, Marx doesn't calculate the labor put into the generations of innovations it took to create a product. If a single engine takes 100 hours to produce, it is worth 100 hours of labor. The years of toil it took to come up with the engine, and all the small improvements over the years to create better engines, are not factored into the price. Only the immediate labor it took to create that single product is factored. Kropotkin rejects this. For Kropotkin, it is nearly impossible to determine the actual value of an object, and this is due to us being unable to calculate the near infinite amount of man-hours it took to innovate on products until this time. Quote, all things for all men, since all men have need of them, since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth. End quote. Everyone is laboring in society, working towards producing the whole of society, and one man's input cannot then be calculated. Kropotkin therefore moves to a moral argument. He asserts, quote, no more of such vague formulas as the right to work, or to each the result of his labor. What we proclaim is the right to well-being for all, end quote. Marx gives us an economic argument. In his economic argument, he articulates that capitalism necessarily has theft, the theft of surplus value. Marx starts from economics, and from this derives moral assertions. Kropotkin seems to say that the pricing of objects determining the value of goods, and so on, is impossible in economic terms. Rather, Kropotkin stands his argument up firstly on a moral claim, that all men have a right to well-being. This chapter is dedicated to complaining about the rich. Kropotkin observes that if the bourgeoisie spent less time in leisure and more time working, it would increase productivity. He levies some critiques against capitalism that may have merit, such as observing companies participating in creating artificial scarcity to maintain high prices of a commodity. He then restates his thesis, quote, we must recognize and loudly proclaim that everyone, whatever his grade in the old society, whether strong or weak, capable or incapable, has before everything the right to live, and that society is bound to share amongst all, without exception, the means of existence at its disposal. We must acknowledge this and proclaim it loud, end quote. The rich are bad, and we should share everything. In this chapter, Kropotkin further delineates himself from the communists of his time. He firmly proclaims, quote, every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communist anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in societies, the pursuit of equality, end quote. This is a claim that is in direct contrast to leading Marxists or communists of Kropotkin's era. Lenin and Marx have problems with this. Lenin would agree with Kropotkin that communism itself is in fact anarchic, a society that is without a state. He says as much on page 55 of The State and Revolution. Quote, we do not at all disagree with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as an aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must make temporary use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as a temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. End quote. However, Lenin would hold the idea that anarchy leads to communism in great contempt. Marx and Engels seem to have similar views, with Engels even calling, quote, authority a necessity, end quote, when talking about the revolution on page 55 of The Housing Question. For full transparency, I'm actually taking this quote from Lenin's The State and Revolution. I've not personally read The Housing Question. However, even internet sites like the Anarchist Library and libcom.com have other documentation of Marx critiquing anarchism. Kropotkin also rejects the concept of labor vouchers, a concept critical to Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat. Lastly, in this chapter, Kropotkin asserts that a man has a natural inclination towards communism. Quote, "Those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue." Thus, we find a tendency, eminently communistic, springing up on all sides and in various guises, in the very heart of theoretically individualistic societies. End quote. I find the idea that people being willing to help others for no gain is evidence of an inclination towards communism to be idiotic. One could easily point to the numerous instances of one person tricking or acting violently against another person as a counterexample of a seemingly natural inclination that goes against communist ends. I also reject the concept that being willing to help another person without expectation of reward as being evidence of communist tendencies. Man can be kind and not be a communist. Kindness can exist in a man, and communism can still be a failure of a system. Kropotkin gives clarification to his positions. He rejects the critique that a communist wishes to redistribute everything, to take everything from the rich, even their clothes. Quote, "What we want is not a redistribution of overcoats, nor do we want to divide up the wealth of the Rothschilds." End quote. He instead insists that under his system, everyone would be lifted out of exploitation and be given the fruits of society. However, within the quote provided, there is a lie. For communism to come about, it would be a necessity that the Rothschilds' wealth be divided up among the masses. If we wanted to be charitable, we could say that Kropotkin thinks that everyone would be able to live like the Rothschilds, but if that is the case, then it is painfully naive and stupid. This is the position. Quote, "This is why an anarchist society need not fear the advent of the Rothschild, who would settle in its midst. If every member of the community knows that after a few hours of productive toil, he will have a right to all the pleasures that civilization procures and to those deeper resources of enjoyment which art and science offer to all who seek them, he will not sell his strength for starvation wage. No one will volunteer to work for the enrichment of your Rothschild." End quote. I reject that society would be constructed in this way on Kropotkin's terms. At most, I could see a scenario where through an extremely intelligent AI, man could live in a relative abundance. This also appears to me to be sugarcoating what would need to happen in order for this to occur. In any communist revolution, it's clear that the rich, Rothschilds included, would see their possessions ripped away from them and likely have their lives ended. Either Kropotkin is ignorant to this, displaying his painful stupidity, or he is lying to make his message more palatable. He also expresses his opinion on why revolution is necessary. Quote, "All is interdependent in a civilized society. It is impossible to reform any one thing without altering the whole. Therefore, on the day we strike at private property under any one of its forms, territorial or industrial, we shall be obliged to attack them all. The very success of the revolution will demand it." End quote. The capitalist system is not one that can be reformed. It must be destroyed all at once. If it isn't completely destroyed, we will not get our communist utopia. Kropotkin also demonstrates that he doesn't know what private property is. Private property is simply the ownership of something that isn't owned by the state. You buying something makes it your private property. However, Kropotkin has an issue with socialists and their view on private property. Quote, "Nevertheless, some socialists still seek to establish a distinction, of course. They say the soil, the mines, the mills, and manufacturers must be expropriated. These are the instruments of production, and it is right we should consider them public property. But articles of consumption, food, clothes, and dwellings should remain private property. Popular common sense has got the better of this distinction. Shelter is as much an instrument of production as the tool or the machine. The same argument applies, for obviously, to food." In this argument, Kropotkin is attempting to show that food, shelter, etc. are all parts of production, and that the means of production are to be considered public property, not private. Something being a means of production holds no bearing on whether it is private or public property. So even if food and shelter can be defined as a means of production, that does not impart on them the quality of public property. Frankly, I'm not entirely sure what this would mean. Does this mean I do not own the food I eat? Can the anarchist commune take away my food since it isn't mine? Could I be denied food in the name of the commune? I am of the opinion that this is an idiotic attempt for Kropotkin to avoid the obvious issue that private property needs to exist on certain levels. Rather than simply addressing the critique and stating there will be some property not owned by the commune or by the individuals in the commune, he attempts a semantic sleight of hand. He attempts to redefine what something being public property means. He equates public property with something being a means of production. This is an incorrect definition. Public property is property owned by the government, or a commune in this case. Private property is property owned by an individual. The moment I'm given an apple for personal use, it is no longer owned by the state, but is owned by me and is therefore private property. Kropotkin fails to understand the actual critique by the socialists here and provides a mind-bogglingly stupid argument about what is and isn't public property. This entire section is so jaw-droppingly ignorant, I'm genuinely shocked. I'm truly sorry for all socialists who had to endure this intense stupidity from Kropotkin. Chapter 5 begins thusly. That we are utopians is well known, so utopian are we, that we go to the length of believing that the revolution can and ought to assure shelter, food, and clothes to all, end quote. This is Kropotkin participating in a straw man. A society where everyone has food, clothes, and shelter is easily conceivable and becoming closer and closer to a reality. The reason people are accusing Kropotkin of being utopian is because he believes anarcho-communism is achievable. A stateless society of any level of complexity cannot exist. The moment people come together and start creating rules on how each other shall act and then begin enforcing those rules, a government shall exist and anarchy shall cease to exist. This type of structure is both good and necessary. It is the lack of government and belief that everyone shall live as kings that makes Kropotkin a utopian. However, this chapter has the one thing that I think Kropotkin is correct about over Marx and Lenin. Marxism has an issue called simple and complex labor. The issue is this. Some labor requires years of training and others don't. Someone can pick up a plow and become a farmer relatively quickly. Becoming a medical doctor, however, requires years and years of rigorous training. But training doesn't produce anything. And if a doctor's labor and farmer's labor is paid the same, then why would anyone spend all this time to be a doctor when they could acquire all the same goods being a farmer? Even granting that some people, through their own volition, will become doctors for the love of the craft, it is obvious we would see a massive shortage of doctors. A massive shortage of any jobs that require large time investments on the part of the laborer. This problem was so fundamental that Marx actually disregarded the labor theory of value entirely to fix it. He proposes that complex labor should be paid more than simple labor. The issue with this is obvious. The value of a product can only be determined by its labor input. Then 1 hour of work a doctor did to make something should be worth the same 1 hour of work a farmer did. Kropotkin correctly identifies this as an issue and rejects the distinction. However, his solution is sadly dumber. Kropotkin says that in his society, everyone will be fine because he will abolish wages. Quote, collectivism, as we know, does not abolish wages. Though it introduces considerable modifications into the existing order of things, it only substitutes the state, that is to say, representative government, national or local, for the individual employer of labor. Under collectivism, it is the representatives of the nation or of the district and their deputies and officials who are to have the control of industry. It is they who reserve to themselves the right of employing the surplus of production in the interests of all. The coming revolution can render no greater service to humanity than to make the wage system in all of its forms an impossibility, end quote. In summary, we must remove all forms of wages, including wages based on labor. This too would create the problem of labor shortages. Less people will participate in difficult jobs due to them not receiving benefits from participating in those jobs, and therefore there will be labor shortages. It is a simple fact that a large swath of people join professions to acquire more money. I myself am currently studying law, not for the love of the law, but because I want more money than God. Under Kropotkin's society, I would do nothing all day and just live in my free mansion. Kropotkin is also cool with starving people. Quote, a society where work is free will have nothing to fear from idlers. Where provisions will run short in a month, our critics at once exclaim. So much the better, we say. It will prove for the first time on record the people have enough to eat. End quote. Once the new society forms, we will have idlers, like me, and we will go through our rations within a month. This is okay, because at least for the first time, everyone will eat. Frankly, it's better to have a system where a few people starve, but most eat, rather than having a system where everyone eats for 1 month, then we are all starving. My assumption is that Kropotkin is simply not taking this critique seriously, so he has elected to hand wave it away. Also, this quote is funny. Quote, "Men, women, and children will gladly turn to the labor of the fields when it is no longer a slavish drudgery, but has become pleasure, a festival, a renewal of health and joy." End quote. Backbreaking labor will be cool and fun under anarcho-communism because there are no more capitalists. There is nothing intrinsic to such work that makes it horrible. It isn't the physical stress caused to your body, the sun beating down on you, the dirt, or anything like that. No. The real reason this job sucks is because the capitalist is exploiting you. That is the only reason this job sucks. Once the capitalist exploiter is removed, then the job will feel better, because instead of giving all the products of your labor to the capitalists, they are instead given to random people in your commune. Here, Kropotkin addresses housing in his future society, but started the chapter by completely rejecting the labor theory of value, saying, quote, "A house in certain parts of Paris may be valued at thousands of pounds sterling, not because thousands of pounds worth of labor have been expended on that particular house, but because it is in Paris, because for centuries, workmen, artists, thinkers, and men of learning and letters have contributed to make Paris what it is today, a center of industry, commerce, politics, art, and science. Because Paris has a past, because, thanks to literature, the names of its streets are household words in foreign countries as well as at home, because it is the fruit of 18 centuries of toil, the work of 50 generations of the whole French nation." End quote. In fact, here Kropotkin comes so close to the capitalist's subjective theory of value that it is insane. Instead, he says that because of all these things, the determining of something's value is actually impossible because no one could mathematically calculate it. He also reiterates his faith in the rebelling working class. I haven't much touched on this topic, but it is in nearly every chapter of this book. Kropotkin continually gives his fellow man too much goodwill. He admits that during the time of revolution, people will have unequal housing, but believes that everyone will be okay with it. Quote, "But everyone will want a fine house or a spacious flat," we are told. No, you are mistaken. It is not the people's way to clamor for the moon. On the contrary, every time we have seen them set about repairing a wrong, we have been struck by the good sense and instinct for justice which animates the masses. End quote. It is reiterated over and over again that people will endure hardship and grief, all due to their internal sense of justice and love for the future society. This is folly. Blind faith in one's fellow man to continue to deal with inequality, starvation, and so on in the name of the revolution. He naively asserts that the sense of justice in every man will keep the revolution together and stable because his own philosophy has to idiotically reject any form of government. It is a theoretical failure that will so clearly fall apart as to render it laughable. He also makes claims about the future of housing without providing any evidence. He says that the future houses of his society will, quote, "be palaces, fairer and finer than any capitalists built for themselves, will spring from the ground of our enfranchised city," end quote. Everyone in this anarcho-communist utopia will have a better house than the Rothschilds currently do? How? How will this be accomplished? Will there be roving bands of construction workers and architects happily volunteering to build mansions for their fellow comrades? How will they all voluntarily organize under no duress to finish every project? This idea is completely fanciful and unrealizable. People will make clothes for each other once properly socialized. Basically the same idea as to why people will make houses, food, etc. It is time to break down Kropotkin's intense confusion on value. Throughout the book, Kropotkin seems to be flip-flopping between value systems. He clearly doesn't agree with capitalism, but also rejects Marx's view on the labor theory of value. However, he only uses concepts that apply to the labor theory of value. The concept he continually discusses is surplus value. For clarity, surplus value is the difference between the amount raised through a sale of a product and the amount it costs to manufacture. That is to say, if you make a hammer and sell it to me for $10, and then I take the hammer and sell it to someone else for $15, there is a $5 surplus value. I haven't added any labor to the creation of the hammer, and therefore have added no value to the hammer. Despite this, I still sold it off for a profit of $5, and therefore have stolen value according to Marx. But Kropotkin rejects this calculus and Marx's labor theory of value, stating that we can't know how much anything is worth because we can't calculate the value of all the work of everyone in all of society and in all of history. However, he still uses the concept of surplus value despite rejecting labor theory of value. This means anytime he brings up surplus value in his argument, he is conceding to labor theory, which means the rest of his theory has to be completely wrong or he can't invoke surplus value. He invokes surplus value here, stating, quote, "The evil lies in the possibility of a surplus value existing. Instead of a simple surplus not consumed by each generation, for that surplus value should exist, means that men, women, and children are compelled by hunger to sell their labor for a small part of what this labor produces, and above all, of what their labor is capable of producing. But this evil will last as long as the instruments of production belong to the few," end quote. Basically, the sentence makes no sense if Kropotkin doesn't believe in the labor theory of value, which he doesn't. The concept of surplus value only works if you believe in the labor theory of value. So then what is he talking about when discussing the possibility of surplus value existing? Two options. One, he's a profound idiot who doesn't actually know what surplus value is, a reasonable assumption, seeing as Marx thought Kropotkin was a moron. Or, when he discusses surplus value, he literally just means extra stuff, as in stuff that is not immediately consumed. In either case, he is an idiot. He's an idiot because he has no clue about any theory of value, or he thinks we shouldn't save things, as in we shouldn't save products for bad times, like when there's a plague or blizzard or anything else that might negatively affect the economy and require we have stored up resources. This also invites further examination of Kropotkin's theory of value, due to him ending this section saying the economy should be, quote, "producing the greatest amount of goods necessary to the well-being of all, with the least possible waste of human energy." This is a nice quote and a good feeling idea, but I have a question. How am I to determine the amount of goods necessary if I have no theory of value? Kropotkin has repeatedly rejected any theory of value, so how am I to distribute goods? I need a system of valuing things in order to properly distribute the things. His response would basically be, the people will figure it out with their sense of justice and love of their fellow man. But how? Justice and love for your fellow man doesn't help me determine the value of a chair. No one actually needs a chair. We can all just sit on the floor. So how do I determine who needs the chair, Kropotkin? Here, Kropotkin discusses the need for luxury and about science and art. He claims, quote, "All great researchers, all discoveries revolutionizing science have been made outside academies and universities, either by men rich enough to remain independent or by men who undermine their health by working in poverty." This claim is intended to illustrate that individuals outside the normal apparatus of society make the most discoveries. If this were true, Kropotkin believes it would indicate that under his society, we would see a greater flourishing of discoveries and scientific research. The issue is, his claim is false. We can always look to those who are somewhat outside the system as men of great discovery. The vast majority of breakthroughs occur within universities and capitalist businesses. Irrespective of your views on pharmaceutical companies, they produce all the new drugs. Irrespective of your views of universities, they create the vast majority of new discoveries, and so on. He also talks about artists making stuff for art's sake, which is fine. Kropotkin talks about work and gender equality. He thinks women should be liberated from the home and be allowed to work, which is based. I agree. Good job, Kropotkin. He also thinks some factories would be cool to work in. That is dumb, and would suffer from the same problems I laid out when discussing how working on a farm would suck even under anarcho-communism. Moving on. This chapter is intended to show that workers could freely and voluntarily associate to create a better society, but inadvertently just shows capitalists working together really well. Quote, "The agreement between hundreds of companies to whom the railways of Europe belong was established without intervention of a central government, laying down the laws to the divers societies. It has subsisted by means of congresses of composed delegates who discuss among themselves and submit proposals, not laws, to their constituents. It is a new principle that differs completely from all governmental principle, monarchical or republican, absolute or parliamentarian. It is an innovation that has been timidly introduced into the customs of Europe, but has come to stay." End quote. These capitalists sure do know how to run a business. Maybe Kropotkin should become an anarcho-capitalist since these savvy businessmen are so good at running stuff. I also reject that no government was needed in the creation of these railways. A state is required for an economy to exist. Without a state, there would be no regulations, no police officers to protect businesses, no judges to enforce contracts, no system to allow the capitalists to create deals and work together. So not only does Kropotkin's example fail to prove the validity of people freely associating without state interference to get things done, I would argue his examples show the strengths of having a state and the strengths of capitalism. It is an abysmal example to give to try and prove why anarcho-communism would work. Here, Kropotkin attempts to deal with some objections he feels to be particularly pressing. He says, quote, "Besides in support of their thesis in favor of private property against all other forms of possession, should not the economists demonstrate that under the form of communal property, land never produces such rich harvests as when the possession is private? But it is not so. In fact, the contrary has been observed." End quote. This has not been observed. Most strikingly, the examples Kropotkin has given in previous chapters actually shows the people, when freely associating under capitalist enterprises, do good work. His example in the previous chapter of capitalists running railways in Europe is a prime example of this. This is the failure of many of his observations. He continues to point to people coming together under capitalist structures as somehow evidence of anarcho-communism being viable. The non-capitalist examples he does give are things like the Paris Commune of 1817. I find this example to be terrible because the Commune lasted only 2 months. Frankly, I find that time frame to be so small that it would render little worthwhile economic information. Secondly, the fact that the Commune failed so quickly seems more evidence against any kind of communism. If the revolution fails so quickly, then why would I support it? I much prefer a long-lasting and relatively stable capitalist state, rather than a state that will collapse quickly but will give me the fruits of communism for an extremely brief time. Another example he gives is the Commune of Canton in Vaud. I couldn't find much information on this, but it appears to be in reference to communes in Switzerland, but they seem to be small self-governing counties, and not this communist communal government that Kropotkin implies they are. Kropotkin reiterates the necessity to remove wage work. Quote, "Wage work is serf work. It cannot, it must not, produce all that it could produce. And it is high time to disbelieve the legend which represents wagedom as the best incentive to productive work. If industry nowadays brings in 100 times more than it did in the day of our grandfathers, it is due to the sudden awakening of physical and chemical sciences towards the end of last century, not to the capitalist organization of wagedom, but in spite of that organization." End quote. I would argue the insane amount of productivity and increase in living standards we have seen since Kropotkin wrote this indicates the falsity of the latter half of his claim. Kropotkin then goes into theorizing how organizations under anarcho-communism would be. He says, quote, "Let us take a group of volunteers combining for some particular enterprise. Having its success at heart, they will work with a will save one of the associates who is frequently absent from his post. Someday, the comrade who imperils their enterprise will be told, 'Friend, we should like to work with you, but as you are often absent from your post and you do your work negligently, we must part. Go and find other comrades who will put up with your indifference.' If he hinders his comrades by laziness or other defects, he is compelled to leave the workshop." End quote. This is the closest that Kropotkin gets to explaining how his society would deal with those who do not cooperate with others as he would like. However, Kropotkin rejects the idea that any physical force would be necessary to maintain these structures. In this, he is idiotic. What would happen if the idler refused to leave? Would those working towards the project diligently be forced to live with him? They aren't supposed to use force, so they have no recourse. In short, so long as someone doesn't conform to social pressures, Kropotkin's society will fail. Considering there have always been people who do not conform to society, I see this as being a very fundamental problem to Kropotkin's worldview. He has no means by which to enforce the rules he so clearly wishes to be enforced. He even refuses to force people to work, thinking that somehow social isolation will be enough to punish people while the idlers reap the rewards of the whole society for free. Kropotkin claims, quote, "If we are rich enough to give you the necessaries of life, we shall be delighted to give them to you. You are a man, and you have a right to live. But as you wish to live under special conditions and leave the ranks, it is more than probable that you will suffer for it in your daily relations with other citizens." End quote. Even if you are lazy, no good leech on society, you do nothing, are a general nuisance, and so on, you will not be punished. Frankly, if anarcho-communism were to exist, I'd recommend me and my fellow idlers form social groups so we can dick around and do nothing all day while the suckers around us work to fill our bellies. Here, Kropotkin spends a lot of time restating what we've already gone over. He derides other collectivists for supporting government and wages. The only real value here is how clearly he finally states his view on value. Quote, "There can be no exact measure of value, of what has been wrongly termed exchange value, nor of use value with regard to production. If two individuals work for the community 5 hours a day, year in, year out, at different work, which is equally agreeable to them, we may say that on the whole, their labor is equivalent, but we cannot divide their work and say that the result of any particular day, hour, or minute of work of the one is worth the result of a minute or hour of the other." End quote. To summarize, Kropotkin is rejecting the notion that two laborers necessarily produce the same level of value, even when laboring the same amount of time. While this section is important, it mostly retreads the ground we have covered. It rejects labor checks specifically. For those curious, labor checks are simply the money of communism. If you work 1 hour, you get 1 hour of labor checks to go spend. He is against labor checks due to rejecting the idea that we can accurately value the products of labor, and due to seeing, quote, "all wages theories have been invented after the state and capital to justify injustices at present existing, and that we need not take them into consideration," end quote. We could explore how he intends to distribute goods if he has no means by which to determine value and no means by which individuals can exchange goods and values, but I feel as if that has been covered in earlier parts of this discussion. Kropotkin thinks we should produce what people need. How can we determine what people need in a system that doesn't believe we can determine value in an economy? I don't know. Kropotkin doesn't like dividing up labor. How he intends to produce these grand mansions he discussed in Chapter 6 dwellings without large scores of people specialized in construction and architecture, I have no idea. Frankly, how any economy expects to create any meaningful amount of products without dividing up labor and expecting people to specialize, I have no idea. This is one of the few times where I have some agreement with Kropotkin. The concept of entire nations specializing is being brought up. He discusses that it is of value for nations to diversify their products. Quote, "On the contrary, it is to the advantage of every region, every nation, to grow their own wheat, their own vegetables, and to manufacture all produce they consume at home. This diversity is the surest pledge of the complete development of production by mutual cooperation and the moving cause of progress, while specialization is a hindrance to progress." End quote. Now, I agree that a nation ought to create more necessary resources within their borders, but for different reasons. My reasons are that if trade breaks down with certain countries for whatever reasons, we as a society should still have access to food, water, and other necessities, even if they come at an increased price. You should also specialize your economy so you aren't reliant on one single resource. One of the issues with Venezuela, for example, is that it is so dependent on oil. Had their economy had greater diversity, they would suffer less economic hardships. Kropotkin's reasoning is stupid. Specializing your economy for certain industries can actually be incredibly beneficial. Any country that has access to many seaports should specialize in sea-based trade. Any country rich in precious minerals should mine those and put more resources into procuring those mines. It is not a hindrance to progress to specialize. It is only a potential danger for economies if they over-specialize, as is the case with Venezuela. Kropotkin then discusses how the revolution would completely destroy trade and upend the economy. This prospect should be horrifying to any rational person. This would destroy many nations' abilities to get food, water, medicine, energy, and numerous other essential resources. People would starve and die off en masse. Kropotkin's solution to this is frankly insane. Quote, "Should the revolution break out tomorrow in Paris, Lyons, or any other city, should the workers lay hands on factories, houses, and banks, present production would be completely revolutionized by this simple fact. International commerce would come to a standstill. So also will the importation of foreign breadstuffs, the circulation of commodities and provisions will be paralyzed. And then the city or territory in revolt will be compelled to provide for itself and to reorganize production. If it fails to do so, It is death. If it succeeds, it will revolutionize the economic life of the country." End quote. Some of you may die, but that is a sacrifice Kropotkin is willing to make. Either you will all be forced to become farmers or you will starve. Hopefully, after all that, you'll get anarcho-communism, though. Kropotkin then makes further idiotic predictions on how industry will develop. For example, he says, of course, they will not only cultivate, they will also produce those things, which they formerly used to order from foreign parts, end quote. How will peasants that have been forced into subsistence farming be able to produce foreign parts? He also completely fails to understand why certain things are made in foreign markets. What if you live in an area where there's almost no iron? How are you going to create steel for tools without trade? How will you repair all the tools you're now using for farming? How about all the chemicals that go into making medicine? How will you acquire the chemicals necessary for this medicine as everyone farms? How will you acquire all the various lab equipment? How will you acquire the plastics just to make the rubber gloves to make medicine if you aren't within 100 miles of a rubber manufacturing plant? The simple answer is you won't. Under Kropotkin's plan, you will get nothing. The moment industry becomes decentralized is the moment the modern world and its luxuries disappear. Kropotkin talks about farming. He thinks that under communism, people would make more crops somehow, even though they wouldn't need to specialize into farming, wouldn't have trade to get equipment or resources to farm, and no one would need to work, so a lot of people would check out of society. He also cites Americans moving into the prairies as evidence of why anarcho-communism would work, even though Americans moving into the prairie did so because they were promised free land to move onto and make their fortune, which sounds pretty selfish and capitalist to me. I understand why Lenin wanted to shoot all of the anarchists, if this is the idiotic drivel they believe in. It is not hyperbole to say this is one of the worst pieces of political and economic theory I have ever read. When reading Lenin, I disagreed, but I could at least see his thought process, his logic, and his ideas flowed from one to another. Lenin was clearly an intelligent man, but horribly wrong and evil. Kropotkin is an imbecile. He continues to invoke labor theory of value ideas, despite claiming to not believe in that theory. His views on human nature are naive and childish. He seems to genuinely believe that people will just get along. It unironically feels like I'm reading a straw man that a conservative made of communism. Marx and Lenin pull from Hegel for their social views and from in-depth, albeit wrong, analysis of economics. Kropotkin pulls from nothing and produces nothing. This book is the idle prattling of a child. It shouldn't be taken seriously, and I have derived no value from reading it other than genuine shock that anarcho-communists have managed to wander away from their handlers to get on the internet and spout this idiocy. Anarcho-communists aren't the worst communists because they're evil or wrong. They're the worst because they have nothing of value to say, nothing of value to add to any society. I'm sorry to any person who has ever had the displeasure of interacting with an anarcho-communist. I'm sorry to the Marxists, the Leninists, the Socialists, and whomever else has the misfortune of being associated with these knuckle-dragging Neanderthals. This book is so terrible, I've decided to increase my score of Lenin's The State and Revolution to at least 2 out of 10, just so that it isn't viewed to be nearly as terrible as this piece of shit. I give The Conquest of Bread a 1 out of 10,